You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. And now it's time here at 95.6 BRFM to hear the interview I did with Patrick Wright, talking all about the secret life of Uwe Johnson in Sheerness. I must say a big thank you to Patrick for taking the time out to talk to me in the week. We caught up with him at one of the Dockyard terraced houses, a lovely historic setting to do this interview in. I started off by asking Patrick to introduce himself to listeners before he started talking all about the life of Uwe Johnson in Sheerness.
Well, my name's Patrick Wright, and I sort of write books and teach some. Now I'm teaching at university in London. But what brought me to Sheppey this time around was my interest in this German writer named Uwe Johnson, or Uwe Johnson, as we might say it in literal English, who came to Sheppey in the early 70s and lived on Marine Parade in Sheerness for 10 years, and he died there too in rather terrible circumstances. I first heard of Johnson when I was a student at the University of Kent, which was then only in Canterbury, and the university was new then. It was 1970 I went out, and it was quite experimental, and it had this idea that the world's going to be different than it has been, and we read all this stuff you wouldn't normally read, and we read novels by this man Johnson, who was known as one of the leading writers of the divided Germany. This is the Cold War, remember, and Germany was divided between the communist East and the capitalist West, putting it crudely. So I read these novels, which one was called Speculations about Jacob or Jacob. There was another called Two Views, and they were really interesting because they were about people who lived on both sides, or families that had found themselves separated, or people who went across the border from east to west, and a bit vice versa, and found themselves in two separate worlds that were nevertheless connected. And Johnson was interested in this in a very, obviously, he had political ideas about it, but the novels were about refusing to choose to some extent. So instead of saying capitalism is freedom and wonderful and communism is evil and wicked, he sort of was interested in what was happening on both sides of this new distinction. And he didn't want that simple choice. He saw the simple choice as part of the problem. So I remember reading these and I thought, well, this is an interesting writer, and then I didn't think about him again. And then in 1974, I was teaching. That was my first job. I was a permanent supply teacher for 2 terms at the Sir William Nottage School in Whitstable, which was then a big secondary modern in Whitstable. It since got burned down one summer. I suspect I know who did it, and replaced with an academy, which is there now. But anyway, I remember sitting in those classrooms looking over the Isle of Sheppey, and I wasn't a very good teacher. I went and did other things in my life later, but I remember looking out of the classroom and thinking, well, how am I going to make this situation work? And I was often looking at the Isle of Sheppey. So I had this view of Sheppey, which was across the swale, and it's interesting how islands conjure ideas. Sheppey to me looked like some sort of wonderful other world. I didn't know anything about what was on at Shell's Ness and what Laysdown Beach was, but it just looked like I was looking into another domain.
It looks very different. Myself, it looks completely different to when you're living here and you go there and look back at it.
It's a wonderful view. It's like looking across at the Isle of Wight. You think, well, I wonder what goes on over there. I wonder how they live over there. It looks separate, and you sort of romanticise separate places sometimes. And so I remember coming over here, and I do remember driving over the old bridge and getting to Sheerness and seeing, I guess I saw the steel mill, which then would have been working, and I drove down Marine Parade, and I got to the ship ashore, and at that time the wall hadn't been heightened, so you could actually see quite a lot. And I remember thinking, this is a nice place, which I must get to know more about, but it obviously wasn't separate from the world as it looked from my Whitstable classrooms. So anyway, what happened to me was that I was aware of Johnson, I was aware of Sheppey, and then I was living in Canada for a while, and I discovered that Johnson had moved to Sheppey, and I couldn't believe it. I just thought, well, how does that possibly happen? By then he was a very famous writer in Germany, feted, really famous, given prizes, published by the best publishers. His books, incidentally, were published by very good publishers here at that time as well. But anyway, so I always knew that there was this old question: how did this writer end up living in Sheerness? So for years I had it in the back of my mind, and then recently I found a way of raising money from a trust. So that's what I did. I raised some money to get these, because I'm never going to speak German. I'm not good enough with languages, and I'm too old to start. So I thought I got a very good I got some money. I phoned the people in Germany who own his rights, his publisher, and said, "Can we translate these?" And they said yes. So, but here's the man you've got to do it with. And they gave me a man who lived in Brooklyn, a nice man called Damien Searles, who's done it. So I've got all these translations of these texts, which are rather marvellous. I mean, there are stories about Sheerness, there are lots of letters in which he gives very detailed accounts of his life, and he's full of interest. He likes what he sees. So we got these texts, and that's sort of what I'm now putting together and trying to make sense of.
So kind of a hidden view, or someone's view of the island that people have never heard, certainly here.
Well, you say to people around Sheerness, to this day, do you know that the most famous German writer of the 20th century, or one of them, lived here for 10 years?
No, not until I spoke to you.
No, but then you go to people who live next door, they say, "Oh, I remember Uwe." We didn't know how to say, was it Uwe or Uwe? We called him Charles. He said to us, "Call me Charles, because at least you can pronounce that." So there are people who remember him quite vividly. But of course they didn't really know. They knew he was a writer, but a lot of them wondered. They thought, I suppose that there is a tradition of people hiding out in Sheppey, and they thought, what's this guy doing here? His neighbour but one, Martin Ainscombe Harris, the painter, he remembers thinking, is he a millionaire? Is he poor? He said to me, we didn't know. We thought maybe he was like Mick Jagger. We imagined that Mick Jagger has places he can go and live a normal life. I'm not sure this is true, actually. But that's what people didn't have a clue what was going on. And Johnson's reasons for coming here were never made clear. He had been living in New York, where he's writing this enormous 4-volume book called Anniversaries, which is his great work. He moved back to Berlin. He had some difficult arguments with various people. He was often attacked on the political front in Berlin. He wasn't interested in that. I mean, his view was not so. He had to leave the GDR, so he didn't have any illusions about what East Germany was about. But he didn't like triumphal Western ideology either. He didn't like the people that were going to win the Cold War, and they're all evil over there. So he wasn't interested in those sorts of extremes or extremist positions. And he always said, "I'm just a writer trying to understand and write a novel. I want to talk about the way people live, about the way they experience the world." So that was his position. But anyway, he came here, I suspect, because he got fed up with these political arguments in Germany. I think money was a function. He didn't have much money. And he bought a house. He borrowed money from a friend, bought a house on Marine Parade, which of course wasn't very expensive by the standards of the time. This was 1974. And he moved here, and I think his aim was to finish this enormous novel that he got a bit blocked on. So that was what happened. He turned up in 1974. He had his wife, Elizabeth, and his daughter, Katerina, who was 10 or 11 at the time of coming. And he stayed. And basically what happened was he kept his head down. And he wasn't pleased to be invited to speak at literary festivals. He didn't encourage people to come and visit him. He would go back to Germany quite often and give talks and lectures. He went to the States a couple of times. But basically, he wanted to be on his own, making his own time, with making his own links to Sheerness.
So it's a place he could escape to and live more normally.
Yeah, he escaped to it, and he didn't have to sort of constantly justify himself or engage in these endless arguments about whether he was this sort of writer or that sort of writer. And his publisher paid him in advance every month. He was a lucky writer in that sense, although anybody who got an advance out of publishers knows that they're a mixed blessing, because the minute you receive it, you owe them a book. And if the book isn't written, the stress just builds up, and he was absolutely in that position. He published 2 volumes of this book called Anniversaries, and he had a third one which came out sort of just as he came, but the last one was unwritten, and that's what he had to do. And he was struggling with that. So that's what happened. Now, the other thing one has to say about the situation was that Johnson was a pretty troubled individual, and he was not well. He had a heart attack in his first year, I think, maybe his second year here, and he was a terrible drinker, and that really is one of the things that got the best of him. So what he did when he was in Sheerness was I've got all this from these letters he wrote, sometimes to terribly famous people. He was a friend of the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who was like the queen of New York at this time, or one of them, and he was writing all these letters describing the seafront at Sheerness and saying, I'd like to have you on the bench next to me, and we could look at the ferries going by, and we could consider the place we're in, you know. So he was doing all that, but what he tended to do was to develop a kind of particular interest in the working people of Sheerness. He didn't like them. He didn't want to become too friendly with the artist next door. In one of his letters, he said, "My God, we just got here, and what do you know? We knock on the door, and we got an artist next door." He said, "We came here to get away from artists." So he was quite sort of separate from people of an educated nature. But down at the local pub, he became part of a group of, you know, mostly middle-aged Sheerness people. He drank, I think, more or less every night at what are the pubs called? One was the Seaview Hotel, which of course I only saw once before it was demolished.
Yeah.
But he was in the bar at the Seaview Hotel, and then he was at the Napier, where he's still commemorated. There's a thing on the wall, and I think there's even, or there was until fairly recently, a stool that he used to sit on. So he was kind of registered there as a singular figure. So what he did, and then the writing he did, a lot of it is about the people he met in these bars. Now, what we're talking about is people who are, there's a lady who had been briefly a ballerina or a dancer who lived in a automobile in a car park. There were people who lived in Sheerness and also in Minster who worked sort of semi-casually around the docks. Driving cars as they were unloaded to car parks, or, you know, people who had been involved with shipping. You know, people who were living this quite sort of hand-to-mouth life with jobs that were pretty insecure and which changed quite often. And these are the people he engaged with. And he wrote a lot about, he wrote about their conversations, he describes discussions, he's full of praise for their attitudes. There's a wonderful story he wrote about a man who has a few too many pints, sets off home, crashes his car, and this may be fairly, not the drinking I'm sure, but it may be fairly typical of Sheppey. He crashes his car into somebody else, gets out and realises he knows who he's driven into, and it's the wife of somebody who, etc., etc. And what Johnson loved about this story was that instead of, when the husband of the wife, this was the 70s, remember, turned up to sort the problem out, instead of saying all this stuff and swearing at him for driving into his wife when he was drunk, obviously, picked him up, made sure he was all right, his wife wasn't hurt, and then said, I'll lend you my second car so you can get home. And Johnson thought this was wonderful, this sort of sense of people being together, their solidarity, this sense of, you know, the community, if you like.
So he discovered it.
He discovered it, and he loved it. I mean, so here is this famous writer who is... I think about it a lot, and my reading is that basically he was raised as a child in East Germany. He had a terrible childhood. When he was born 5 years before the Second World War, so when he was 6 or 7, he was put into a school for the master race Nazi training, you know. And then by the time he was a bit older, the war was over, and the family had to flee east because he started off in a part of Germany that then became Poland. They made it to the east, but not into what became West Germany, and he was incredibly poor. He worked in a small village. He was at a school that was all about communism. So by the time he was 17, he'd been boiled up like a saucepan full of water 2 times, once as a fascist and the second time as a loyal communist. So he was full of all this sort of, kind of extremity of experience. But in East Germany, he never felt out of sorts with the people. And in a way, I think what Sheppey gave him was something that appealed to the East German side of his experience. Now, what I mean by that is that, on the one hand, Sheerness is very similar to the parts of North Germany on the Baltic that he knew. I mean, you go there and The marshes there look just the same as the marshes on Sheppey. The port looks just the same, Rostock and Wismar, all these places that were bombed to pieces in the Second World War, much more than Sheppey. But you look at the North Sea and the sea views, it all looks very, very similar. Yeah? So I think there's a landscape he recognised in
So he felt comfortable with it?
Yeah, he felt comfortable with the place. And also, he wrote quite often about how he couldn't bear Surrey, the smugness, the comfort, the sort of ease, the sort of selfishness, as he saw it, of all these people with lots of money and smart houses worth a fortune in Surrey. He said, I don't like Surrey. Come to Sheppey, where it's all rough and real. So that was his interest. And I think what happened was that he liked the fact that, as in East Germany, there wasn't a kind of bunch of overeducated people telling everyone what they had to think. And I think he liked that. I think he liked the sense of, being in a working class town, which of course Sheerness was and really is still. It's that, I know these definitions change, but I think in the 70s that would have been what Sheerness was. That's certainly how people saw it. So my feeling is that what actually happened in Sheerness for Johnson was that he found a world in which he could coexist and get on with people. And he did things that were remarkable. I mean, one of the old guys in the pub came in one night and said, I've got cancer and I'm not going to last long. And he said, it's a pity, he said, I've always wanted to, I've never been to the Isle of Man. And I don't know whether he came from there or what, but for some reason, he wanted to go and see the Isle of Man. So Johnson, instead of saying, oh, tough, you could look at a picture or whatever, he went and arranged a trip, and then he went with him. So, this writer who nobody could get hold of in the literary world takes this guy who's at the end of his days and, sorts out a trip, and he took him for a week, and he says we looked at each other a lot without passing too many words over cracked cups of tea in various sort of out-of-season seaside resort, sort of hotels or the restaurants. So, but he did that, and he took another one to the States. He always thought Sheppey was a little bit like Staten Island, which is it's a huge island, it's a borough of New York, but it's very industrial and it's very low and it does flood. So he took one guy from the Napier to spend a bit of time walking around Staten Island in New York. I mean, these are huge trips, but he did these things. So this is very interesting. What happens in Germany is that his time here is seen as a disaster, almost an embarrassment. The best writer, and what happened? He was allowed to go and rot in Sheppey. That tends to be the way it's described. But when you look at his experience here, he was full of enthusiasm for the place. He loved it. His life went horribly wrong, but I don't think that's Sheppey's fault.
No, for him it works.
Yeah, it works for a while. I mean, what happened to him, unfortunately, and this is terribly sad. I mean, this is a bit of a tragedy because he did manage to finish the book, which is called Anniversaries. I can talk to you about that in a minute if you like. But what happened was he got into sort of terrible psychological stress, and I think the drink certainly can't have helped. And I don't know what else was going on, but he developed a view which was probably almost entirely paranoid, that his wife, who had come from the East, like he had, she'd come through, she'd been smuggled through the frontier, he had been able to go with permission, and they'd married him in the West, in West Germany. But he developed this view that his wife, who'd had a brief affair with a guy in Prague before he married her, had sort of kept in touch with this guy, which was true to some extent. And he developed this idea that she had betrayed him. And it just became a sort of, I think, I read this and I think the psychiatrists talk about something called morbid jealousy, which is basically dangerous. I mean, a woman living with a man with morbid jealousy is probably well advised to leave the house, because it can go very unpleasantly wrong. But something like that happened to Johnson, and he became convinced that his wife not only had betrayed him, but that she was a Stasi spy, that she was, that basically what she was a kind of Secret Service spy. And it is possible that one of the reasons he came to Sheppey was because he did worry that, because he was very famous, the East German authorities were keeping an eye on him. And like many people who come here, you can hide in Sheppey.
Yeah.
Certainly, I don't think the Stasi reached here. I don't know, but I doubt it. But anyway, be that as it may, what happened was he destroyed his own family life because of this. He threw his wife out. And worst of all, he disowned his own daughter. And these are terrible things to do. And you can't. In a sense, it's not for me to say they're excusable or not, because they happen in other people's lives. It's not for me to comment, except to say that this was terrible, and its consequences were bad for everybody. And then, he was on his own. He was finishing this book. He did manage to finish it, but eventually all this, the drinking and the ill health caught up with him, and he died in 1984, so 10 years after he came, in February. And he died on his own, and he died and lay there dead for 2 weeks in his house before anybody discovered him. Terrible story. It happens when people are on their own, they do die. But what happened with him was particularly bad because, it was unfortunate because he was often away, and he had these systems, he had these electronic lighting systems to basically to persuade the burglars of Sheppey or of Sheerness, should there ever be such people, that he was in. Yeah. So the lights kept going on and off at weird times. So nobody actually ever knew whether he was off in Germany giving a lecture or whether he was there. So basically what happened was his body was discovered and it was all over. But he was 49, and that's the story. So, and of course it got worse because the death was all over the place, and a journalist came and broke into the house from Germany and photographed all this stuff. And so there was terrible prying went on, and all these other very famous people like Günter Grass, who just died recently, were outraged, and this journalists were getting sacked. But all of Germany for a while was gossiping about this and reeling with horror at what had happened. And it's very touching because Elizabeth and Katharina actually stayed in Sheerness for quite a time, where nobody knew about this. I've talked to people who remember them and who learned. Elizabeth taught German, and they were respected, well-regarded people, and probably in a funny way, having had this terrible 4 or 5 years of living in the same town as the father and husband who wouldn't talk to them. Maybe they were mutual in this, I don't know. But they then had this terrible situation of all this stuff going on in Germany. And Sheerness being, I suppose, one of the reasons they might have stayed is because at least they were out of that, didn't know what was going on. So people here, it's been very interesting to talk to the people here who remember him, because they know it was bad. People feel terrible about his death, people who were around or lived near him. Nobody wants to be in a street where that is even possible.
Yeah.
So people behave terribly well, even though it went horribly wrong. And it's interesting that so people just the German tide of discussion just didn't reach here. So that's basically what the story is. But the writing is very interesting, and he was a major figure. So that's basically who he is.
So you mentioned he managed to finish the novel. I was hoping you could tell our listeners a bit more about that.
Yes, well, it's an enormous 2,000-page, 4-volume novel, which is called Anniversaries. And what it is a book which is centred around, it's based in between Germany and New York. So Johnson was in New York working for a publisher. He was preparing a textbook for English students of German in 1967 or thereabouts. And what he did was he constructed a situation where he's got this woman called Gesine Crespal, who is German, from the part of East Germany he came from, which is the north, Mecklenburg, sort of up near on the Baltic. And so this woman moves to New York with her daughter Marie. The woman is, late 30s, whatever, maybe early 40s. Marie is 11 or 12. And so the mother is German still, and she's working in a law firm or a bank or something as a secretary or something of that sort. The daughter is in the New York school system. So the daughter is really sassy and New Yorky, and the mother is still quite strict and German. And basically what is happening is there's a conversation that runs through the year from 1967 to 1968, in which Marie says, who are we? Where do we come from? What is this family? Why are we in New York? All this sort of stuff. And Gesine starts unpacking the family story. And she goes right back to the end of the First World War. So it's like Peyton Place, only more experimental, because basically it's a family saga with Cassina and recounting the story of the generation of her, mostly of her grandmother and her father. So it starts in about 1920, the active history, when the first Nazi putsch happened, the Kapp Putsch it was called, just after the First World War, when Germany's all collapsing and the future is beginning to emerge. And then it goes through these several generations. And this is told through this one year in 1967 to 8, which of course is full of turmoil. I mean, Johnson, clever man, nobody could have told when he started this in 1966 that this was the year to choose, but he had the Vietnam War, he had Martin Luther King's assassination. So the chapters, often he uses the New York Times. He's very funny about it. He mocks it and teases it. And he has these events of the year, and then he has the longer German history of the Second World War and of fascism and all these ghastly things he lived through, coming up through. So the anniversaries are dates which in New York represent ordinary days in which the New York Times may talk about whatever is in the news, but also historically the same dates lift up a longer history, which is the family history. So that's the book. And what Johnson was doing with this book was advancing through this year to 1968. And by the time he got to end of volume 3, he'd taken too much of that year. So he'd got the German history from 1920 to the Second World War, and then he had the whole of the post-war period, the whole experiment with communism in East Germany, and he only had 2 months left. So that was one problem he had. But the other was that he was blocked by too much excess. Gunter Grass said, never did a man light the candle at both ends, and you can't do it. You can't live a long life if you live like that. So he was, goodness knows what he was doing to himself. I mean, he was out and he was active and he was certainly drinking. And I think there are slight hints sometimes that he was doing other things as well. So that novel is major. And one of the things I really like about it is this image of the wave. He always uses water as, and it opens with this, in the first scene is a couple sitting on a beach in the Baltic, looking at the Baltic from North Germany, and these waves are coming in. And he has this idea of the wave and the anniversary as being very similar. So the GDR system believed history was like a winch, that it's all going to the future, the state is in control, and it's like Stalin told the Russian people in 1937 they were happy and they had to be happy. And the GDR, the East German regime, was like that. It had an idea that we're going somewhere, that we're going to get there, and if you think we haven't got there, there's something wrong with you, not with us. But what Johnson does was he uses the wave, where each wave is different, but they're similar, and they're in a sequence. So he uses this as a way of talking about the passage of time and history. So when I look at what he does when he comes to Sheppey, he buys a house which has the biggest sea view you could get. You look out of Marine Parade, and he was here before they extended the seawall. Yeah. And from every floor, almost his basement, but probably not, but certainly from the first and the second, the ground floor and the second floor, first and second floors, your window is just full of the sea.
So he didn't want to feel trapped by surroundings.
Yeah, that's right. And also he had this idea of the sea as kind of what joined him up. He wrote a wonderful piece while he was here about how every moment in his life he'd been on a river. He listed all the rivers he'd lived next to, and he said the river is... And of course, when he was a child, he was always on boats, and when he was a young man and a student in East Germany, he was canoeing. So he loved water, and it was something to do with freedom and, possibility. And it must have been like that for the sailors of old. We look at the water in our seaside towns, and we tend to feel trapped by it. But it must once have meant, look, you could go and get rich, you could do all sorts of stuff, you could travel. So I think in a way, water was important to him in that way. It was a real thing that he loved, but it was also a kind of symbolic thing that he felt happy with, and he liked to think with as he was designing his compositions. So basically that's what happens. He stays here, he doesn't go far, but he writes wonderful accounts of being German in Sheerness. There's a very touching account where he goes out, first time he opens his mouth, and he's asked his directions, and the woman he meets says, knows he's a foreigner. He says, the minute I open my mouth, it all looks fine until I open my mouth. And then he's aware that he's German, and he knows that, we've had all these wars, And this woman, it's very touching because she says, "Oh no, I know you. You remember." She keeps saying these things, and she's mistaken him for a Scottish airman she had an affair with in the Second World War, and she's been waiting for him to come back ever since. So she's got this slightly crazy she's convinced that he's this stranger that she's been waiting for forever. So he has all these very nice interactions. But basically, he lives in his house. He goes across to the beginning of Neptune Terrace. There was then a little cafe in the basement called the Dolphin Cafe, which he always had lunch in, particularly in his last years. And it was basically, bacon and eggs and the full English experience. And the proprietor's always going broke and fleeing and changing hands all the time. And then he went to the 2 pubs. So in this very small area, he thought everything he wanted to think. It's quite, so you've got the sea producing all this imagery for him. You've got the wall outside his window. He didn't like the extension of the wall when it was heightened in 1980 or thereabouts. But this is the man who's known as the writer of the Berlin Wall. And it's tough to end up living in a place where these guys come out and just heighten a concrete wall directly across the road from your house. But he put up with it. He likened that seawall to the works of Albert Speer, who's Hitler's architect. So he saw it as horrible and regrettable. And he wrote a wonderful piece, a big piece about the Richard Montgomery, which, as you all know around here, is I don't even need to tell you what it is. But he saw this as proof that history was still potent, that things were still capable of going off with a terrible discharge. And he went around the place collecting quotations from people about it. And how it was called Our Only Attraction by what somebody said, it's our only attraction in Sheerness. People come in and look at the end of the world. But what interested him about it was that it was a new problem in his time, because he was writing at the time when they were building the Thames Barrier.
Yeah.
And that was also the time when they were heightening the sea walls. And I've not yet found out about this. I think they might be linked. I mean, presumably when you close the Thames Barrier.
Yeah, I think they are. I've heard before that's why they got hired, because of the Thames Barrier.
Because of the Thames Barrier. So, and the way he describes this, he says absolutely typical of people with power and money and means. In this case, he means Londoners looking after themselves, but abandoning the little people who haven't got power, who haven't got numbers. It's like if anybody chose to land an airport on Sheppey, which they did plan to do in the 70s, I think. There's hardly any resistance because there aren't enough people of influence in a place. So he took the side absolutely of the ordinary people who were mistreated by power, maybe corporations, who had to live their life buffeted about. One day you're in a dockyard, the next day the dockyard's closed. One day you're in a steel mill, the next day the steel mill's gone. He had that great respect for how people in difficult circumstances, where the power is not with them, still live lives full of dignity and solidarity and comradeship almost. I mean, he didn't like Stalin and all that stuff, but I think he did like that idea of people having, people who don't have much have a lot of social sympathy in common, and he wanted to praise that.
So I was going to say, it's actually indirectly, I suppose, captured some of the people that lived here on the island of those times that would have never have been recorded. I think it's really interesting because they're people who nobody would ever record. You're absolutely right. And also, he was a recorder. I mean, it's what he did in Germany, for example, before he came here. He went and interviewed people. He knew how to do that really in-depth journalistic thing. He wasn't a writer who liked just to make it up out of nothing. He wasn't a fantasist in that way. He was a writer who worked with real social historical stuff. So what he did was and his notebooks are amazing because there's one list of fish and what can be caught off this esplanade in different places at different times of year. And he's doing this by interviewing people who are fishing off the esplanade, or off the beaches, or off whatever bit of pier there remains. So he's doing this almost sort of like, I'm going to record what this world is. And he kept saying, but he did something to say he was going to write about this place, that he had plans to do a book about this part of England. And it's certainly true that he had hundreds of books about Sheppey and North Kent. So he was gathering material up, and who knows what he might have done with it. I think you can see in what he did do, which is a full. I mean, it would make a 200-page book, the stuff we've translated.
it's I think you can see what he was interested in and what he might have explored more, you know. Very, very, it's good. And as you say, nobody really is there in that period. There are a few social investigators. I mean, Ray Powell from Kent does a lot of investigation of the Sheerness economy after the dockyard closed in 1960, but he does it sort of about the same time. So, you know, Johnson's reports, which aren't meant to be for sociological investigation purposes at all, they're letters to friends mostly, or stories, or lectures to give to audiences, are not, they're confirmed by the sociology. I mean, what Ray Powell saw was people learning to live without full-time employment. He called it the unofficial economy. He saw households where women's work was becoming more important and where people had 4 or 5 different types of economic activity. They would be doing up houses, they'd be doing a bit of part-time work, they'd be 2 days a week doing posting, or some of them would be poaching or working on allotments. And he sort of saw this happening as a way of, in which as people kind of coped with the fact that all those full-time, mostly male jobs had disappeared. And I think Johnson's testimony tells the same story. But to me it's fascinating because people look at, people in the mainstream now, people on, I was going to say on the mainland, people who plan policy in London and stuff, they talk about places like Thanet and Sheppey and all the estuary. They use this phrase, they call people here the left behind, as if people who live here have kind of not got with the contemporary world. It's so arrogant and it's so incurious and it's so insulting. And that's one of the reasons I think the Johnson material looks so interesting now. So here is a man who was high-minded, he was impatient, he was not an easy man, but he was quite capable of seeing his way into ordinary experience. And he had a great respect for it, and not in a patronising way. You know, I mean, it wasn't as if he was sitting there saying, "This is what ordinary people are like." It's not at all like that, because he's right there with them. He's kind of disordered. He's in the pub like anyone else.
So he felt comfortable. He had a real interest in it.
Yeah, and he's a sort of damaged like anybody else is at that time and at that age, and so he's one among others, and that's how he writes.
What are you going to produce out of this?
Well, several things, I hope. I will get these translations published in some form before long, but over this next year or so, when I'm doing the project, what I'm planning to do is to sort of try and bring these things into Sheerness or into Sheppey in different ways. And so I've been talking with the Little Theatre and the people at Big Fish Arts in Sheerness, and we're planning an event in February. What we're going to do is we're going to get these pieces of text that we translated, and we're going to read them. And if it works, some of them are like little bits of play, of just voices in a pub in a conversation. And if we can get it to work, we're going to do a performance of them. And I'll say a few introductory things to make it all make sense and explain who this man was and stuff. But the key thing will be Sheerness people putting these words out, voicing these descriptions. And I hope that'll be interesting to people. And I hope it'll create a kind of discussion that we can then go on and do more with. And it's brilliant. It's a way of just saying, look, these texts are strange and accidental, and it's weird that they're here at all. It's strange that they ever got written. But they do give you a really interesting access into what life in Sheerness was like in that decade from 74 to 1984, which is, it's a long time ago now, but it's still where the island we're on now was sort of shaped in a way, in this sort of post-dockyard world.
Yeah, and still well in living memory.
And well in living memory, yes. I mean, I've talked to several people who remember this whole story very well, and who were always puzzled by who was this strange German man, walking around, who was always very polite and a little bit withdrawn and withheld. So in a way we're still...
I was going to say, are you still looking for people?
Yeah, I'm looking for people, I really am. I mean, because when we broadcast some of this on a BBC programme, and what I discovered then was there is this thing, I didn't know about this before, the Sheppey emigration. Of course, given the economy around here, people have been leaving to go and do other things. But when we did this radio programme, thanks to the BBC iPlayer, all these people who lived on Sheppey and who grew up and were living in Australia or America or Canada started sending emails to me in the translation. I've got these very, very accurate memories of particular buildings and streets as they were in Johnson's time, from people who haven't necessarily been to Sheppey for 30 years, but who still, they probably tune into your programme as well, actually. I hope they do.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
So I think of it as the Sheppey diaspora, the dispersed people who went off and made their own way, but carry something of Sheppey in their heart. It's nice. So that's what I'm hoping, is we can pull all this together, and then my written account, which I'll do through this year, and put out the following year, will be full of those memories as well. That would be great. So yeah, I'd love to hear from people who remember this strange German family, and there are people who remember Elizabeth as well. So it would be good to hear from people.
How would our listeners contact you if they do have memories or things they'd like to let you know about from what we've talked about?
Well, if people remember Johnson or the Johnsons and have anything, I'd love to hear from them. The best thing to do is to give you an email address, I think. It's patrick.wright, spelled with a W, @ kcl.ac.uk. KCL, which is short for King's College London.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out to introduce our listeners to what you're doing, and we hope to follow the story and catch up with you some more times in the future.
Good. No, it's great, because part of this is all about. I'm hoping to link this together with the Dock Church Preservation Trust as it goes ahead, because recovering the buildings and recovering the history. I mean, it can all be made to serve the same purpose, I think.